For 3 weeks straight, every night after 9, the young CEO found herself unsettled by something she could not explain. It wasn't a report, a number, or a performance issue, though she understood perfectly. It was a man, a quiet, low-level employee who never drew attention to himself, a single father, as she later learned, though at the time he was simply another name in a system she had mastered. Yet there was something in his eyes every evening as he prepared to leave, something steady, something heavy, something that refused to fit into the neat categories she relied on. He always left at exactly the same time, exhausted but composed, in facts, carrying a kind of silent determination that made her pause without knowing why. No one else noticed him. No one thought to ask about him. And for a long time, neither did she, until one night, driven by a question she could no longer ignore, she followed him through the quiet, rain-soaked streets, telling herself she only needed to understand. 17 minutes later, standing motionless in front of a glass window, she came face to face with a truth she had never expected to find. What she saw did more than change how she viewed him. It forced her to confront everything she believed about people, about judgment, and about herself. She had always trusted her instincts, built her success on clarity and certainty. But now a single moment threatened to unravel that confidence completely. What do you do when one truth makes you question every assumption you have ever made? That question stayed with her, echoing long after that night, because the answer was not simple, and it was not comfortable. She had not become the CEO of Meridian Systems at just 29 by second-guessing herself or hesitating when decisions needed to be made. Isabella Grant believed in a simple philosophy. Outcomes were the only language that truly mattered. Show up, deliver results, and do it again. Anything else, in her mind, was noise. Emotions distracted people, and potential was just a softer way of describing something unproven. She had shaped her company around this belief. Building a culture that was lean, fast, and relentlessly focused on accountability. And she took pride in it. The kind of pride that comes from giving everything you have without holding anything back. There was no difference between who she was in the early morning and who she was late at night. She carried the same sharp clarity throughout the day, direct in her thinking, observant in her judgment, and slightly impatient with anything unclear. To her, the most honest way to measure a person was not by what they said or intended, but by what they produced when no one was watching. Meridian itself reflected that mindset. It wasn't a flashy company that made headlines, but it played a critical role behind the scenes, building infrastructure software that kept hospitals running, logistics systems moving, and city utilities functioning without interruption. Isabella had taken control of the company at 26. Stepping in after a failed acquisition left the original founders needing a fast exit. Within 8 months, she had completely restructured the organization, making difficult decisions with precision and without unnecessary drama. She retained those who truly understood the product and rebuilt the leadership layer almost from scratch. The results were undeniable. Revenue jumped by 38% within a year. The board admired her efficiency, and her directors respected her in a way that always carried a subtle layer of caution. She wasn't harsh, but her precision had a certain cold edge to it. Every morning, she arrived at the office at exactly 7, before the building filled with noise and activity, and walked through the floor quietly, observing everything. She noticed who was present, who wasn't, and how people carried themselves at their desks. Over time, she had developed what she privately called a sense of momentum, the ability to tell the difference between real effort and something that only looked like effort. It was this instinct that had guided her career, and she trusted it completely. She ran her company with a level of structure that many of her directors quietly found excessive. But to Isabella, It was simply the minimum required to maintain clarity. Every week, she held detailed performance reviews, examining each department with careful attention, looking not just at what had been done, but how consistently it was being delivered. Alongside this, she maintained a private spreadsheet, one she updated every Friday evening before leaving the office. It was precise, organized, and color-coded: green for strong performance, yellow for acceptable fun, and red for areas that required attention. She would have said, if asked, that the system measured outcomes, not people. But the longer she worked with it, the more that distinction blurred. Over time, each row began to represent more than just numbers. It became a quiet judgment. And in that system, one name had remained unchanged for months: Sebastian Cole. His row had been a pale yellow for 3 consecutive quarters, not poor enough to demand immediate action, but never strong enough to stand out. He worked as a Level 2 IT support technician, a role that rarely received recognition, but quietly held everything together. His days were filled with routine tasks: fixing printer issues, adjusting network permissions, deploying internal software, resetting passwords than ever, and handling the endless stream of small technical problems that kept the company running smoothly. It wasn't exciting work, but it was essential. And Sebastian handled it with a steady competence that showed up in his metrics exactly as expected. His tickets were resolved on time. There were no major failures under his watch, and user feedback stayed comfortably average. He had been with Meridian for 4 years, long enough to survive 2 major rounds of restructuring that had cut nearly a third of the workforce. He knew the company's older systems in a way that only came from experience, not from manuals, but from years of hands-on work. That knowledge had proven useful at times, though it had never been formally acknowledged. Isabella had considered addressing his performance more than once, thinking about whether he needed to improve or simply move on. But each time, something practical held her back: his understanding of the older systems, though not reflected in her metrics, made him difficult to replace, so she left his status unchanged, not promoted, not removed, just maintained. To her, Bill, he wasn't a person she needed to understand deeply. He was a temporary decision, a placeholder until something clearer revealed itself. There had been a moment months earlier that, in hindsight, deserved more attention than she had given it. During a quarterly review, her IT director had mentioned Sebastian almost in passing, noting that he had quietly resolved a complex issue with the backup server cluster, something 3 other engineers had spent nearly 2 weeks struggling to diagnose. He had fixed it without drawing attention, documented it briefly, and moved on as if it were just another routine task. The director had spoken about it in a tone that almost sounded apologetic, as though the achievement didn't quite fit the usual expectations of performance. Isabella had acknowledged it, but she hadn't adjusted anything in her system. To her, one isolated instance didn't change a pattern. Patterns were what mattered. They revealed consistency, and consistency was what she trusted. What she didn't consider was that the pattern she relied on might not be visible within the hours she chose to observe. Sebastian wasn't difficult to manage. He didn't complain, didn't involve himself in office politics, and rarely spoke unless it was directly related to the task in front of him. He didn't push for recognition or try to stand out in meetings. To most of his colleagues, he was dependable but unremarkable. Someone once described him as the kind of person who fixed things without ever seeming emotionally invested in them, and that description had stayed with Isabella because it matched what she thought she saw. It wasn't entirely accurate, though she would only understand that later. For now, he, Rome. It was enough. But over the following weeks, something small began to draw her attention: his routine. Every evening, without exception, Sebastian left at exactly 8:45. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. At first, it seemed like nothing, but the more she noticed it, the more deliberate it felt. There was a precision to it that didn't align with carelessness or lack of ambition. It felt intentional, almost disciplined. Isabella had always believed that commitment revealed itself through time. Those who stayed late signaled drive, while those who left on a fixed schedule often signaled limits. She had unconsciously placed Sebastian into that second category, assigning meaning to his behavior without ever questioning whether that meaning was correct. The night that finally forced her to question everything began like any other, but quickly shifted into something far more serious. Around 7:15 in the evening, a system failure started spreading through one of Meridian's core network layers. A corrupted configuration file had triggered a cascade, affecting multiple connected systems in ways that were difficult to trace. It was the kind of deep, hidden issue buried in the oldest parts of the architecture, complex, fragile, and rarely touched. Most of the engineering team would have needed hours just to locate the root of the problem, and even longer to fix it. Isabella had been on a board call when the alerts started coming in. She stepped out to find tension already building across the floor. Her IT director was juggling multiple calls. Junior technicians were staring at their screens with quiet panic, and the atmosphere had shifted into that familiar pressure of an unresolved crisis. And then she saw Sebastian. He was already at his station. Already inside the system, moving through layers of diagnostics with calm focus. He didn't rush, didn't react to the urgency around him. He simply worked steady, precise, and completely absorbed in the problem. He traced the failure step by step, moving backward from visible symptoms to the hidden cause, noticing smaller issues along the way and addressing them without hesitation. There was no performance in what he was doing, no attempt to show others how capable he was. He wasn't explaining, wasn't drawing attention. He was just solving. Within 41 minutes, the cascade was stopped. The system stabilized the system. And along the way, he had identified 2 additional weaknesses that could have caused future failures. He documented everything in a short, clear report, just enough to make the solution usable for others. And then, without pause, he shut down his workstation, picked up his jacket, and left. It was 8:42. Isabella stood there, watching him walk toward the elevator as if nothing unusual had just happened. He didn't look back, didn't check if anyone had noticed. There was no sign that he expected recognition. He simply walked out with the same quiet determination she had seen every night, the same unreadable weight in his expression. She remained there long after he was gone, turning the moment over in her mind, unable to ignore the question forming inside her. 3 days later, she followed him. 3 days later, on a quiet Thursday evening, she acted on the question she could no longer ignore. The city was covered in a soft, steady drizzle, not heavy rain, but the kind that blurred streetlights into warm reflections and made the roads shine. Isabella left the parking structure just minutes after Sebastian's car and kept a careful distance as she followed him through the familiar grid of downtown streets. She told herself this was a necessary step, that she needed clarity, that as the head of the company she had the right to understand the people within it. But even as she thought it, she knew the reasoning felt thin. Still, she continued, at a red light, the light. She paused behind him and briefly questioned what she was doing. A CEO trailing one of her employees through the city over something as vague as a feeling. It sounded unreasonable. Even to her, yet she had trusted stranger instincts before, and they had led her to success. That was enough to keep her moving. A few blocks later, his car turned onto a quieter street she didn't recognize. The area was different, less polished, lined with small businesses and older buildings that seemed untouched by the rapid changes happening elsewhere in the city. There was a stillness to it, as if it existed outside the usual flow of attention. Sebastian parked in front of a modest building with a single lit window. There was no bold signage outside, only a small handwritten notice inside the glass that she couldn't read from where she was. He stepped out of his car and walked straight in without hesitation. Without hesitation. Like someone returning to a place that had long been part of his routine, Isabella stayed in her car for a moment, the heater running softly as she watched the door close behind him. Her mind moved quickly through possible explanations: a second job, a private arrangement, something that might raise concern, but none of them felt certain. She had no proof, only curiosity. After a brief pause, she turned off the engine, stepped out into the damp evening air, and followed him inside. The lobby was simple and quiet, with just a couple of chairs, a coat rack, and a reception desk behind glass. A woman sat there, calmly reading on a tablet, her presence steady and unhurried. She looked up briefly, acknowledging Isabella without question. On the wall behind her hung a framed statement about communication and connection, alongside a poster showing carefully illustrated hand gestures. Beneath it, a small sign identified the place: a center for speech and language therapy. Isabella stood still, the meaning settling in slowly, reshaping everything she thought she understood. Without speaking, she walked down the short hallway and stopped at a glass window. And there, she looked inside. On the other side of the glass, everything shifted. Sebastian sat on a small chair clearly meant for children, his tall frame carefully folded into it, without discomfort, as if he had done it many times before. He had positioned himself at eye level with a young girl sitting across from him on a soft mat. She looked no older than 6. Her eyes were focused, serious in a way that didn't belong to most children. Watching him with complete attention, there was something familiar in her expression, the same quiet intensity Isabella had noticed in him. The room itself was simple, calm, designed for patience rather than speed. Sebastian raised his hands slowly and formed a gesture, deliberate and precise. His face remained composed, gentle, entirely focused on her. His lips moved slightly. Not quite speaking, but shaping sounds in a way that could be seen as much as heard. This wasn't ordinary conversation. It was something being built, carefully, step by step. The girl watched closely, absorbing every detail. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, slowly, one of her hands lifted, her fingers trying to copy what she had just seen. The movement was hesitant, incomplete, but full of effort. Sebastian didn't rush her. He didn't correct her immediately or push her forward. He simply stopped moving and waited, holding the moment open with a patience that felt almost tangible. When she finished, her gesture wasn't perfect. It was missing something. Slightly uneven, but it was enough. She looked up at him, but it was enough. Searching his face, and in that instant, something in Sebastian changed. It wasn't dramatic, not something most people would notice, but Isabella saw it clearly. The calm control he carried at work softened, revealing something deeper, something unguarded. His eyes brightened, just for a second, holding a kind of quiet emotion that spoke of long effort and even longer hope. He didn't react loudly. He didn't turn the moment into something bigger than it was. He simply stayed there, present with her, seeing her completely. After a brief pause, he gently repeated the gesture, adjusting it slightly, guiding her forward, and the lesson continued. For the next 20 minutes, Isabella stayed where she was, standing at the glass as the scene continued inside the room. Nothing about it was dramatic in the way she was used to interpreting events. There were no urgent systems, no visible breakdowns, no metrics flashing across screens, and yet it carried a weight she could feel without fully naming it. Sebastian continued the same careful process. A gesture, a pause, a quiet wait, then another attempt. Slightly adjusted, always patient, always steady. The child, Luna, though Isabella did not yet know her name, responded in fragments. Sometimes she succeeded. Sometimes she didn't. But each attempt was met with the same calm acceptance. There was no frustration in the room, no impatience pressing against the edges of the moment, only time being given freely. As if it had no cost at all, Sebastian's attention never drifted. He didn't check a clock, didn't glance away, didn't treat the session as something to complete. He was entirely there, as though nothing else in the world existed outside that small space. Isabella found herself noticing things she had never associated with him before. The way he adjusted his posture so he was always at the child's level. The way his expression softened when she tried. The way he paused just long enough to let silence do part of the teaching. There was no performance in it, no audience, no expectation of recognition. It was simply work, but of a kind she had never measured before. At one point, the girl attempted a gesture that fell apart midway. Her hand stopped, uncertain, and she looked down briefly as if disappointed. For a second, Isabella expected Sebastian to correct her immediately, to push her toward accuracy the way a system would demand correction, but he didn't. He just waited. Then, instead of repeating the same motion, he changed it slightly, breaking it into smaller steps, making it easier to follow. The girl watched again, tried again, and this time got closer. Not perfect, but closer. And that was enough for him. Isabella felt something shift inside her as she watched this unfold. It wasn't sudden understanding. It was slower, heavier, and close coesses than ever. Heavier, like a structure inside her being remeasured in real time. The man she had categorized as adequate at work was showing a form of precision here that her spreadsheets had never captured. Not efficiency in the corporate sense, but something deeper. Patience that didn't run out. Attention that didn't fragment. Commitment that didn't need external reward. She stood there until the session naturally moved forward. Until the rhythm of teaching and responding became something she could no longer separate into individual moments. And for the first time, she understood that she had been looking at Sebastian Cole through a frame far too small to contain the reality of who he was. When the session finally ended, there was no clear ending moment, just a slow softening of focus inside the room. The child seemed calmer, as if something inside her had settled after repeated effort. Sebastian gave one final gesture, smaller than before, almost like a closing note rather than an instruction. And the girl responded with a careful imitation that wasn't perfect, but was meaningful enough for him to acknowledge with a slight nod. That nod carried more weight than Isabella could explain. It wasn't approval in the corporate sense, not evaluation, not scoring. It was recognition, real recognition, the kind that didn't measure output, but effort, progress, and presence all at once. Sebastian stayed seated for a moment longer after the child was guided gently toward another part of the room by a therapist. He didn't rush to leave, didn't immediately shift back into the world outside. Instead, he remained still, as if allowing the moment to fully complete itself before moving on. Only then did he slowly stand, carefully unfolding his tall frame from the small chair, adjusting his jacket with quiet familiarity. He looked tired in a way that was deeper than exhaustion from work. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from giving yourself completely to something that matters more than rest. And yet, there was also a steadiness in him, something anchored. Isabella stepped back slightly from the glass as he turned toward the exit of the room. For a brief second, She worried he might see her. But his focus never shifted outward. He simply walked out of the therapy space with the same calm presence he carried everywhere, as if the world outside this place was just another part of the same continuous responsibility. She didn't follow him immediately this time. She stood still in the hallway, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Her mind, trained to categorize people by output, by efficiency, by measurable contribution, had no clear place to put what she had seen. There were no metrics for this, no color code, no performance band, and yet it felt more real than anything she had ever tracked inside her systems. When she finally walked back toward her car, the rain had stopped, but the air still carried the dampness of it. Streetlights reflected softly on the pavement, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella didn't think in terms of decisions or outcomes. She thought in terms of understanding, and how incomplete hers had been. She drove home without turning on the radio, something she rarely did. The silence in the car felt unfamiliar, almost heavy, as if her mind no longer had its usual structure to fall back on. Everything she had seen kept replaying, not as separate images, but as one continuous scene. Sebastian seated low in that small chair, the child watching his hands, the patient pauses, the quiet effort, and the way his expression had briefly changed when something finally clicked. It didn't fit neatly into anything she understood about work, performance, or productivity, and that was what unsettled her most. She parked in the underground garage and stayed in the car for several minutes without moving. The engine was off, the world outside silent, but her thoughts were louder than they had ever been during any board meeting or crisis call. She tried to place Sebastian into the framework she had always used to understand people at Meridian Systems. It didn't work. The categories she relied on, effective and average, underperforming, collapsed when applied to what she had seen, because none of them explained the weight he carried, or the precision in his patience, or the absence of any visible need for recognition. When she finally got out of the car, she didn't go straight upstairs. Instead, she stood for a moment in the dim garage light, thinking about something she had overlooked for years without realizing it: the difference between what is measured and what actually matters in a life. The next morning, she went to Human Resources with a simple request, presenting it as part of a routine audit. Sebastian's file was brought to her without question. She opened it and began reading carefully, line by line, the way she would normally review financial data. What she found didn't contradict his performance record, but it added context she had never asked for. A second job on weekends, approved, properly disclosed. A stable but modest salary. A child listed under dependence. Therapy sessions partially covered under company insurance, though not fully. She paused at that detail longer than she expected to. Not because it was unusual, but because she realized she had never once considered what those numbers meant outside the system. There was no violation, no policy issue, nothing that demanded immediate action. And yet, for the first time, she understood how little the system actually told her about the reality of the people inside it. She closed the file slowly. The weight she felt wasn't guilt in the simple sense. It was something more uncomfortable, the recognition that she had been making judgments with incomplete visibility and had trusted those judgments as if they were complete truth. She sat with that thought longer than she intended, because it was not something she could resolve quickly or neatly. It was something she would have to carry forward. She stayed with the file open for a few more moments, even after she had finished reading it, as if looking at it longer might somehow change what it meant. But nothing changed. The facts remained simple and unadorned. Sebastian Cole and unadorned. Sebastian Cole. Steady employment, modest pay, disclosed secondary work, and a child whose needs quietly shaped every structure of his life. There was no violation in any of it. No hidden issue for her to correct in the way she was used to correcting things. And that, strangely, made it harder to process. Because there was nothing to fix, only something to understand. She closed the file and leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the glass wall of her office where the rest of the company continued its usual rhythm, people moving between desks, conversations forming and dissolving, keyboards tapping in steady patterns. Everything looked normal, and yet, for her, something fundamental had shifted. For years, she had believed she was seeing clearly people defined by output, performance, measurable contribution. That clarity had built her career, shaped her decisions, and justified her authority. But now she could see a gap in that vision, something large and unmeasured that had always existed just outside her attention. The realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive like a revelation in the way people often imagine such moments. It was quieter than that, more uncomfortable, like noticing, after years, that a key assumption in a long-running system had never been fully validated. She thought again of Sebastian in that small therapy room, not as an employee this time, but as a father, the way he had waited without pressure, the way he had adjusted instead of forcing, the way his attention had never fractured. Even when progress was slow, it was a kind of discipline she had never built into her own framework for success, not because it wasn't valuable, but because she had never thought to measure it at all. That absence unsettled her more than she expected. Later that day, she returned to her desk and opened her internal performance spreadsheet, the same one she had relied on for years. Rows, colors, categories. Green, yellow, red, clean, efficient, definitive. She looked at Sebastian's row again. Pale yellow. Adequate. The word felt different now. Not wrong exactly. The word felt different now, but insufficient, as if it described only a surface layer of something much deeper that the system had no capacity to capture. Without making a formal announcement or change, she opened a new version of the sheet. She kept the structure, but added a blank column at the end of every row. No label, no instruction, just space. Space for what the system did not yet know how to hold. She didn't explain it to anyone. She didn't need to. But as she looked at it, she understood something quietly shifting in the way she would see people from that point forward, not as data points inside a closed system, but as lives extending far beyond the boundaries of what her metrics could ever fully contain. And for the first time in a long time, she accepted that clarity was not the same thing as completeness. That winter, the change in her wasn't loud enough for anyone else to name, but it showed itself in small decisions that slowly altered the atmosphere of Meridian's systems. Meetings still ran with structure, deadlines still mattered, and expectations didn't disappear, but something subtle had shifted in how she looked at the people inside those systems. She began to pause longer before making judgments, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that her earlier certainty had sometimes been built on incomplete visibility. The spreadsheet that once defined her weekly rhythm still existed, but now it felt less like a final verdict and more like a partial snapshot. She found herself noticing gaps where there had once only been categories, not errors in data, but absences in understanding. The blank column she had added remained empty, but its presence alone changed the way she read every row beside it. It reminded her, constantly, that not everything important could be captured in what was already measured. Sebastian, meanwhile, continued his work as he always had, steady, precise, unassuming. His promotion to senior infrastructure architect didn't change his manner. He still arrived without attention, still solved problems without performance, still treated the system as something to be understood deeply rather than displayed publicly. But internally, something had aligned. His knowledge of the legacy systems was now formally recognized. documented, and shared in ways that finally matched its real importance. What had once been invisible was no longer hidden, even if it still wasn't loudly celebrated. Outside of work, his life continued with the same structure it always had. Evenings were shaped around responsibility rather than ambition. Some nights ended at 8:45, others later when problems required him to stay. But the timing itself no longer carried meaning in the way Isabella had once interpreted it. It was no longer a signal of disengagement or limited commitment. It was simply rhythm, life, organized around what mattered most to him, not what was visible to others. At the therapy center, progress came in gradual steps that never announced themselves loudly. Luna's speech developed slowly but steadily, but slowly but steadily, first into short phrases, then into more complete thoughts. Each improvement was the result of repetition, patience, and attention that did not demand speed. Sebastian never treated her progress as something to rush. He understood. He understood. In a way that couldn't be taught through management frameworks, that growth of this kind did not respond to pressure. It responded to presence. And so he remained present, again and again, without needing anything in return except the moment itself. Isabella learned of Luna's first full, clear word only weeks later, not through any deliberate report, but by chance conversation. And when she heard it, she didn't react the way she once might have, by analyzing, categorizing, or measuring significance. Instead, she simply paused, because she understood now that some outcomes were not outputs in a system. They were the result of years of unseen consistency. They were the result of years of unseen consistency, carried quietly in lives that never appeared fully in any report she would ever read. The company continued to grow, but Isabella no longer believed growth could be fully understood through numbers alone. She didn't abandon structure or discipline. Those still mattered. But she had learned to hold them alongside something else, awareness of what they could never fully capture. And in that balance, something in her leadership changed, not in direction, but in depth. She no longer saw people as rows in a system first. She saw them as lives first. She saw them as lives first, and systems second. And once that shift happened, it couldn't be undone. Spring arrived quietly at Meridian Systems, the way most real changes do, without announcement, without disruption, only noticeable in hindsight. The office still functioned with the same precision it always had. Deadlines were still met, systems still ran, and performance reviews still happened on schedule. But the way Isabella moved through it had changed in ways no report could capture. She still valued outcomes, still expected accountability, still believed in structure, but she no longer trusted structure to be complete on its own. There was always, now, a second thought running alongside every metric. What is not being measured here? It wasn't doubt, it was awareness, a correction that never fully finished settling. Sebastian had settled into his role as senior infrastructure architect with the same quiet consistency he brought to everything else. His presence in meetings was minimal but meaningful. He spoke only when necessary, but when he did, it was precise. Grounded in systems he understood better than most people understood their own decisions. The legacy architecture of the company, once a hidden liability, had become something stable largely because of his work. He never framed it as achievement. To him, it was just maintenance of something that needed to function. Outside the office, his life remained centered around the same responsibility that had always shaped his time. Evenings were still divided between work and the quiet rhythm of caregiving. There was no shift in identity, only recognition of what had always been there. Luna's progress continued in steady, sometimes uneven steps. New words appeared slowly, then began forming into sentences that carried more intention, more clarity. There were still moments of struggle, But they were no longer isolated moments of effort. They were part of a longer trajectory that was finally visible in motion. Sebastian never treated her progress as something to accelerate. He treated it as something to honor, a process that unfolded in its own time, not his. And in that patience, something fundamental was being built between them that no external system could replicate or measure. Isabella visited the therapy center again one evening, not out of curiosity this time, but out of a quieter need to understand what she had once misunderstood. She didn't announce herself immediately. She stood at a distance for a while. She stood at a distance for a while, simply observing the room where she had first seen everything differently. Sebastian was there, seated as before, fully present, guiding Luna through another sequence of small saw, careful steps in language. Nothing about it looked dramatic from the outside. No visible transformation. No sudden breakthrough. Only repetition, attention, correction, and patience layered over time until something new slowly took shape. What struck Isabella now was not surprise, but recognition. She could see it differently because she no longer reduced it to efficiency or output. She saw continuity. She saw investment that did not demand recognition to exist. She saw a form of work that lived entirely outside the language she had once used to define success. Later, as she returned to her car, she realized something that stayed with her more than anything else she had learned in years. The most important parts of people's lives were not hidden because they were secret. They were hidden because no one thought to look in the right place. And once you learned that, you could never fully go back to the way you saw before. Over time, that realization didn't turn into a single dramatic change. It settled into Isabella's leadership, the way water settles into stone, slowly reshaping it without breaking it. She didn't stop using data, didn't abandon structure, didn't reject performance metrics. Instead, she started treating them as partial truths rather than complete ones. Meetings became slightly quieter in tone, not less focused, but more attentive. She listened longer before concluding. She asked questions she would previously have considered unnecessary, questions about constraints outside the workplace, about unseen pressures, about what people were carrying that never appeared in reports. At first, it felt unfamiliar to those around her, as if the rhythm of her decision-making had shifted by only a fraction. But that fraction changed things. People began speaking differently in her presence, not because she demanded it, but because they felt less reduced by the frame they were being placed in. Sebastian noticed the difference in his own way, though he never commented on it directly. His work continued with the same consistency it always had, but the environment around it felt slightly more aligned, as if what he had always known intuitively, that systems are built on human lives, not just output, had finally been acknowledged at scale. He still left most evenings around the same time. 8:45 remained part of his rhythm, not as a signal of limitation, but as a boundary that protected what mattered beyond the office. Occasionally, he stayed later when the system demanded it, but there was no longer any unspoken judgment attached to his departure. The meaning of time inside the company had subtly expanded. It was no longer interpreted through a single lens. At the therapy center, Luna's progress reached a stage where conversation began to feel less like construction and more like flow. Her sentences became longer, more connected, more confident. She asked questions not just about language, but about the world around her. And Sebastian answered each one with the same steady attention he gave everything else in his life. There was no separation between his roles anymore in the way Isabella once imagined there had been. He was not an employee in one space and a father in another. He was a continuous presence moving through different responsibilities with the same underlying purpose. One evening, Isabella returned to the therapy center again, this time staying longer than before. She didn't stand behind the glass immediately. Instead, She waited until she could fully absorb what she was seeing, without interrupting it in her mind. The room was familiar now. The room was familiar now, but no less significant. Sebastian and Luna were seated together, not in instruction, but in conversation, small, imperfect, real conversation. The kind that does not exist in performance metrics or quarterly reviews. She realized then that what she had once seen as separate moments, a man leaving work at a fixed time, a technician solving problems under pressure, a father patiently building language from silence, were never separate at all. They were all part of one uninterrupted life, organized around something she had not initially understood. Not ambition, not recognition, but responsibility carried quietly, without announcement. On her drive back that night, she didn't think in terms of conclusions. She thought in terms of limits, of what she would never be able to fully see, no matter how much she improved her systems. And for the first time, that limitation didn't feel like a flaw in her leadership. It felt like a truth she needed to live with, carefully and permanently. After that, Isabella stopped trying to complete her understanding of people in the way she once tried to complete systems. Instead, she began treating understanding as something ongoing, something that could never be fully finished. The change didn't announce itself in policy or memos. It showed up in the way she paused before decisions, in the way she left more space in conversations, in the way she no longer rushed to categorize what she didn't immediately understand. Meridian systems continued to grow, but the culture inside it shifted in a quieter direction. Performance still mattered. Accountability still existed. But there was a new layer beneath it, an awareness that every role, every metric, every line of data represented something larger than what the spreadsheet could hold. People noticed it in small ways first. The tone of meetings softened slightly. Questions were asked with more openness. Feedback was given with less reduction and more context. Nothing became less demanding, but it became less blind. Sebastian remained steady through all of it, as he always had. His role as senior infrastructure architect became increasingly central as the company expanded, especially as older systems were replaced or rebuilt. His understanding of the legacy architecture wasn't just technical knowledge anymore. It had become foundational to how the company transitioned into new systems safely. Yet, he never treated this importance as something personal. For him, it was simply work that needed to be done correctly. At home, his life continued in the same quiet structure that had always defined it. Luna's progress gradually opened new layers of communication between them. Words turned into questions, questions into longer thoughts, and slowly into conversations that carried emotion, curiosity, and imagination. There were still difficult days, but they no longer defined the journey. They were simply part of it. Sebastian never framed her progress as achievement in the external sense. There were no announcements, no celebrations beyond the small, private satisfaction of shared understanding. What mattered to him existed in moments no system tracked. The moment she tried again after failing, she tried again. After failing, the moment she understood something she couldn't express before. The moment silence turned into connection. Isabella understood this more deeply now. Though she never claimed full understanding of it, she knew she would never fully see all the dimensions of lives like Sebastian's, no matter how carefully she tried. But she also knew that the point was no longer to fully capture it. The point was to stop reducing it. One evening, much later, she stood again at the glass of the therapy center. But this time, she didn't look for answers in what she saw. She simply observed Sebastian was there with Luna. What, as always, in the middle of something that had no need for interpretation to be meaningful. And for the first time, Isabella didn't feel the urge to translate it into something measurable. She let it remain what it was, real. Real. Incomplete in explanation, but complete in its own existence. On her way out, she realized something that stayed with her more quietly than any previous conclusion. Not everything important becomes visible through observation, and not everything visible needs to be fully understood to be respected. Some things simply deserve to be seen without being reduced, and that, more than any decision she had ever made as CEO, became the foundation of how she chose to lead going forward.